Imagine you're a detective examining two witness statements about the same event, but the details don't match. One witness says the suspect visited the scene 3 times. The other insists it was only once. Both can't be right. We have exactly this situation with the New Testament, and it reveals something fascinating about how ancient authors actually wrote history. Luke's gospel opens with a promise. The author tells his patron Theophilus that he's providing an orderly account based on eyewitness testimony. By ancient standards, this looks like historiography. It resembles the works of Josephus or Tacitus. This is precisely what makes critical analysis necessary. The text presents itself as historical. Our job is to test that claim. At Luke chapter 9, verse 51, something dramatic happens. Jesus sets his face to go to Jerusalem. What follows is 10 chapters of journey narrative, Jesus traveling, teaching, healing, all while moving toward his fate in Jerusalem. It feels like a travel itinerary. But here's the problem. This material isn't original to Luke. The author pulled it from different places in Mark's Gospel and from a sayings collection scholars call Q. Q is a hypothetical source that both Matthew and Luke appear to have used independently. The journey to Jerusalem is a literary device, not a historical record. Luke stitched together teachings that originally had no geographical context and placed them on a road to Jerusalem. And this creates theological drama. Jesus marches purposefully toward his destiny. The arrangement serves the author's message, not the sequence of actual events. This brings us to a critical principle. Every ancient text has a tendency, a theological or political message. No text comes without ideological slant. Ancient authors weren't trying to be objective journalists. They were making arguments. Our job as readers is to identify what that slant is, and the Luke-Acts has a very clear agenda. The most striking evidence comes from comparing Acts with Paul's own letters. In Galatians chapters 1 and 2, Paul describes his movements after his conversion. He insists he visited Jerusalem only twice in more than 14 years. He emphasizes his independence from the Jerusalem apostles. Paul's point is clear. His gospel came directly from revelation, not from human teachers. He didn't need the Jerusalem church's approval. This matters deeply to Paul's argument about his authority. Now look at Acts. Luke portrays Paul making multiple trips to Jerusalem. Paul appears closely coordinated with the Jerusalem leadership from the beginning. He receives their blessing, reports to them regularly, follows their instructions. These accounts cannot be harmonized. Paul says 2 visits and independence. Acts shows multiple visits and institutional harmony. One source prioritizes Paul's autonomous authority. The other prioritizes his connection to the mother church. Luke has an agenda, a unified early church with Jerusalem at its center. The eschatological material reveals even more. Eschatological means relating to end times beliefs. In Mark chapter 13, Jesus predicts the temple's destruction using cryptic language. He says, when you see the desolating sacrilege set up where it ought not to be. This phrase echoes the book of Daniel, its mysterious apocalyptic imagery. Now compare Luke chapter 21. Luke changes this to Jerusalem surrounded by armies. The cryptic prophecy becomes a clear historical reference to the Roman siege of 70 CE. Luke adds entirely new material. Jerusalem will be trampled by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. This insertion creates theological breathing room. Early Christians expected Jesus to return immediately after the temple's destruction. When that didn't happen, Luke's addition explains the delay. There's now a period of Gentile domination that must run its course. Luke is adapting earlier traditions to explain why expected events hadn't occurred. So what do you do with this? When you read any ancient text, biblical or otherwise, ask 3 questions. First, what sources is this author using and how are they being arranged? Second, what theological or political point is the arrangement making? Third, where do we have parallel accounts that let us check the author's editorial choices? This framework applies to Josephus, Tacitus, Livy, and every ancient historian. This isn't about dismissing Luke Acts as worthless. Finding theological editing doesn't mean the author was lying. Ancient authors didn't share modern expectations of objective journalism. Right? Theological interpretation was considered legitimate and expected. This is about genre, not deception. Right? Luke Acts remains invaluable for understanding early Christian theology, how communities processed their traditions, and how believers made sense of their movement's rapid growth. It tells us as much about the early church's beliefs as it does about the events it describes, and that's actually more interesting than straight history. We gain access to how ancient Christians thought, what they valued, and how they constructed their identity. Read Luke Acts for what it actually is, a sophisticated theological narrative.